I had strict instructions to start at 6:30, so I will start at 6:30. Okay, I'll start talking at 6:30 as people keep walking in. So it's gone nice and hushed, which is great. So I think while everyone's just walking in, I'll just start the... Oh, a few more people coming in. I'll start the introductions very soon. A lot more people coming in. So thank you so much, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Robinson. I'm Director of Grantham Research on Climate Change and Environment, and I'm going to be chairing this event today. Welcome to people here in the audience. This is a hybrid event, so welcome. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be looking to welcome people who are joining online. It's absolute delight. I know there's an almost full auditorium and apparently quite a lot of people online as well, so welcome all. And thank you for joining us for the book launch of my colleague, Professor Dave Stainforth. You can wave if you want. Just in case people don't know who David is. My GRI colleague who's discussing his new book, Predicting Our Climate Future, What We Know, What We Don't Know, and What We Can't Know. And I quite like the subtext of this, which is we're going to get some idea of how climate science works. And Dave tells me, we should be absolutely trusting some conclusions of climate science, and we should absolutely distrust others. So hopefully, I don't think we're going to test you, but hopefully when we've finished listening to the book launch and read your book, we will have a better idea of what we should be trusting and what we shouldn't, and why, I guess, yeah? Why, yeah. So I think as many of us probably know, climate change raises new foundational challenges in science, so we need to question what we know, and we need to question how we know it. And this is what David is sort of going to take us on a journey on. So the subject's really important, but the science is relatively young, although I think for quite a long time people have kind of known what happens if you pump too much CO2 into the atmosphere. But we really need at this stage, and I think ever more than ever, we need to be able to judge sort of what information is reliable and what is still open to question, and understand what to do with that information. And so during this event, we're going to think about why the sort of essential characteristics of climate change make it such a difficult issue to study, and what the sort of series of challenges are across various disciplines. So we're going to go through a journey, all in 30 minutes, I believe, a journey of mathematical complexity, physics of climate, and some important philosophical questions about the origins and robustness of knowledge, and use sort of natural science in the economics and policy of climate change. So that's what lies in store for us today, and hopefully you will think this has prompted you to buy the book, and Dave will be signing copies of the book outside, so the book is for sale and you can have it signed by Dave outside. So just very briefly, I'll give you a small bio, a short bio on David. So after studying physics at Oxford, Dave worked on ocean modelling and studied for masters, and then worked as a renewable energy consultant. He then pursued research on computer models of the atmosphere, and worked with Professor Miles Allen to develop climateprediction.net project. He's worked on research projects addressing climate science, climate economics, climate modeling, and climate decision-making under deep uncertainty. And I'm not sure if you don't tell us in the next 30 minutes what deep uncertainty is, it's in the book, isn't it?
It is.
We'll get a sense of what deep uncertainty is. And he's currently a professorial research fellow at Grantham Research Institute here at London School of Economics. We have joining us virtually, I don't know if we're going to see Catherine just now, but we have joining us virtually Catherine Brown, who's going to be one of the people discussing the book after. Catherine was appointed as the first Director of Climate Action for the Wildlife Trusts in 2022. She leads advocacy and internal work programme on climate change mitigation and adaptation for these trusts. And the Wildlife Trust are a UK charity that look after around 2,300 nature reserves. She's been working on climate change policy and evidence for over 20 years, and in 2022 she was awarded an OBE in the New Year's Honours List for her services to climate change research. So it's lovely to have Catherine with us, if only virtually. Before she moved to the Wildlife Trust, she was head of adaptation at the UK Climate Change Committee. She was managing the Secretariat to the Adaptation Committee and leading the production of the UK's third independent assessment of UK climate risk and analytical work on progress in adapting to climate change. And this work continues with the further reincarnations. And with us in person, who will follow Dave, talking about Dave's book, is Tom Sheldon. He's, oh, sorry, there's Catherine. I can see you on the left now. We cannot see you. Not anymore, we can't. Tom Sheldon is Senior Press Manager at the Science Media Centre. I think we've had a lot of emails, but this is the first one we've actually met in person, isn't it? So that's rather nice. Tom handles issues in the fields of engineering, energy, and environment that are in the headlines. Tom has degrees in artificial intelligence and bioinformatics. He's worked on a number of high-profile stories, including links between mobile phones and cancer, GM crops, climate change and e-cigarettes, and as well as issues around preprints and publicity. So quite a broad remit there. So that's our author and our discussants. And so just to let you know that the Twitter hashtag for this event is hashtag LSE Climate Change. That is the X hashtag, LSE Climate Change. And just to give you, let you know how the running is going to work, this is my brief introduction. Not that brief, maybe. And then Dave is going to talk about his book for about 30 minutes. Tom and then Catherine will each talk for about 10 minutes discussing the books, pulling out some specific areas. And then we'll have about 30 minutes for questions. And we've got my colleague Marion Dumas, who's going to help with the online questions. And I will do the in-person questions. Just to say, if you're asking a question in the room, please wait for a microphone, or people joining virtually won't hear. Please introduce yourself and keep the questions quite focused. So keep the questions shortish, and I might make the panel keep the answers quite shortish as well, depending on how many questions we have, because often we have so many questions that want to be asked, and never enough time to answer them. So I think, hopefully, the event's recorded, hopefully, because you never know the technology, but hopefully there will be a podcast available online. And it'll be available to watch, if it all works to plan, on LSE Live. So we're not planning a fire test. So if the fire alarms go, the exits are. I'm looking at someone there. The exits are here and here. Please exit in an orderly manner. But hopefully that won't happen. So I think at this point I can welcome up here Professor Dave Stainforth. Thank you so much.
Oh, that does work. Okay, thanks very much, Elizabeth, and thanks to all of you for coming this evening. Thanks to everyone online. It's very kind of you to take an interest in this event and indeed in the book. So this book is about how our understanding of climate change fits together. It spans the physical sciences, social sciences, maths, a bit of philosophy. I've seen philosophers in the audience, but only a bit of philosophy, economics and more. And of course, it's targeted at those who are interested in climate change, but it's also essentially targeted at those who might not necessarily be interested in climate change, but who are interested in the science of climate, the science of climate change, and indeed how academia and science work together, and its power and its flaws. It's so in many ways it's a popular science book. That's what it's meant to be, but it just happens to be on a subject that, of course, has great social importance and social interest. But it comes at it from the science perspective. So the study of climate change raises many deep questions in science and in social science about how we understand the world around us. And there are many fascinating issues in its study that are as big and as interesting and as deep as the other great scientific questions, the sort of search for dark matter, the origins of consciousness. I would argue that understanding of climate change is as deep and as interesting as those. And yet, in many ways, those big questions about how we go about climate change science don't come to the fore. They tend to get lost because, understandably, of the social, the societal importance of the subject. And I wanted to write a book that brought those to the fore, that showed the many deep and interesting questions in the subject, deep and interesting and open questions, and perhaps gave something of a hook for young people coming into science to say, actually, there are interesting things for me to get my teeth into here, regardless of whether they have a passion for the subject, passion, perhaps concern, perhaps even fears about the subject, that there are just interesting questions to address. And I guess I also hope that by bringing these big questions to the fore, that there is some ability to raise the level of debate and discussion about how we respond to climate change, respond to human-induced climate change, and can place that discussion in a perhaps better informed context. So many of you I see here work in climate change, and for those of us who do work in climate change, it's not uncommon to come across the phrase that the science is settled. The science is clear, now it's time to act. So the starting point really would be, well, is the science clear? And the answer is kind of, well, yes, but also a bit no. So before I get into the details of that, let me step back a moment. When I started writing in 2016, so it's taken 7 years to write this book. When I started writing, there were lots of books about climate change, and there are even more now. There are lots and lots of books about climate change. I guess I wanted my book to be a bit different, not just another book on climate change, because I guess when most people pick up a book on climate change, they do so with some opinion. They already, in many cases, deeply concerned about the consequences of climate change, or in a few cases, deeply sceptical about whether there's any concern to have. In my book, I didn't want to preach to the converted. That's not where I wanted to start. I wanted someone opening the book to and reading it for the first time to be drawn in by the fascinating issues, the fascinating questions that we have within it. And in fact, the word climate wasn't in the original title. That's not what I first proposed, but OUP wasn't having that, and quite rightly so. So climate is very much in the title now. Nevertheless, in the first few chapters, I steadfastly try to avoid giving any opinions on the social issue, even about whether climate change is real, whether it's important. The starting point is to take an agnostic view on that. But it doesn't really work. You can't really do that. And so once you get 50 pages in, I kind of have to come clean and sort of say, where do I stand on the issue? And that makes a talk like this a little bit difficult, particularly since it's going to be made into a podcast and put online, because it means that I kind of need to give away an early plot twist. Only it's not much of a plot twist. Those of you who know me and those of you who know anything about my work know that where I stand on this issue. And indeed, by 58 pages in, I've already put down my 11-paragraph summary of why the reality and seriousness of climate change are beyond any reasonable doubt. 11 paragraphs are really frustrating. It was 10, but I just felt there was something else that I needed to put in there. So it's 11 paragraphs, that's my summary. So to return to the question of whether the science is clear, let's just be clear on that. The answer is that the reality of human-induced warming is clear. It's founded on clear physical understanding, and it's corroborated by all sorts of observations. The seriousness of the implications for the natural world and for human society is also clear, and there's robust foundations there and robust arguments. So the existence and the character and the scale of the threat That's all clear. Nevertheless, there are many things that are not clear. And indeed, there's lots of things that we don't know, and there's lots of things that we don't yet know how to answer. We don't know how to go about approaching answering some of the questions related to climate change. So while they're, and these open questions exist in the physical sciences, and they also exist in the social sciences and economics. So in some ways, we know we need to act, but there's also a vast amount of information that we don't know, information that would be useful to help us to guide our actions and to motivate our actions and to ensure that we achieve our actions and to plan them better. So how do we do that? How do we get better information? Well, in my view, and this is the section of the talk that I worry about most because it doesn't go into as much detail as it needs to, but there's only a limited amount of time. In my view, academia is not well set up at the moment to address many of these issues. And we could take advantage from quite a significant change about how we approach the study of climate change. And what I'm getting at here particularly is multidisciplinarity. It's about the connections between the physical sciences and the social sciences. And that being a two-way situation. There's perhaps quite a lot of discussion about how the social sciences need to use information from the physical sciences better. But I would argue this goes both ways around, that the physical sciences also need to have a much greater awareness of the social science issues and what type of information would be most useful to them. I think at the moment there's an awful lot of work funded, research funded, that is driven by the idea of guiding the societal response, being responsive to society's needs. But there's significant chunks of work where either the awareness of the conceptual barriers to how much we can understand are not acknowledged, which leads to information that looks relevant but isn't necessarily robust. And then there's other theoretical work which might be very robust but doesn't take account of the particular characteristics of the practical situation we're in, the timescales of greenhouse gas emissions and the warming that we're looking at, which means that you can end up with robust information that isn't really relevant. And in my book, I guess what I'm looking at is trying to bring perspectives together, bring disciplines together, and talk about how we can generate information that is both relevant and robust to society and to our response to this huge problem. So that's one of the themes. Nevertheless, as I mentioned earlier, the overarching theme is how doing that involves intrinsically interesting questions that might well be, for some of us, just worthy of study simply to satisfy curiosity. They are deep questions. So, my book presents a series of challenges across the social and physical sciences. Many of these are conceptual. They're about how we tie down what we mean by climate change, having a common understanding of what we mean by climate change across disciplines, what maths, economics and physics can tell us about these things, how we communicate it, how we use science in economics, how we use social science in physical science, and how the structures of academia influence the conclusions that we draw and our chances of success in achieving robustness. But these challenges aren't always obvious. I'm not going to go through them today, they're all in the book, but they're not necessarily obvious because to get our heads around them and to realise what significant challenges they are requires us to think very carefully about what we're trying to do. What is the target of climate change research? And what are the characteristics of the study of climate change that affect the reliability of the research we do? So the first section of my book handles 7 characteristics, presents 7 characteristics which bear upon when information in climate change research is reliable and really need to be thought about in detail by, I would say, almost any research project on climate change. what I'm thinking about here is saying the characteristics that influence whether information is reliable and about climate change. And here I'm thinking about local or national scale information, the sort of information that enables us to paint a picture of the future under climate change for individuals. It's about making climate change personal, making it relatable, so that when we talk about climate policy issues, that can be related to how we see the future for ourselves. So rather than talking about a 2-degree warming, rather than talking about ice sheet collapse, these things are really important. Nevertheless, in terms of wider engagement, we need to have those pictures of what it means to individuals. And these characteristics, I think, are what are important in doing that. So I'm going to briefly go through these characteristics, these 7 characteristics. So the first is prediction. It's about recognising that climate change is all about prediction. It's predictions that give society a choice of what future we want. So we know something about what the future will look like if we achieve net zero globally by 2050, for instance. And we know something about what the future will look like if we only achieve net zero by 2100, or maybe don't do anything to combat greenhouse gas emissions. The difference between the two is what gives us the choice. That's the motivating factor for taking action. And it's these pictures that are important. It's those predictions that are important. How it tells us, it allows us to ask the questions of what future do we want? How much are we willing to spend to get that? What are we willing to give up? Or, put a more positive spin on it, how do we shift our perceptions of what we value in the light of the choices we have? We don't have the choice of saying we're going to do little today and then still have a great climate future. If you're going to do very little to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that goes along with a particular picture of the future and has to be seen hand in hand. And it's scientific understanding, or academic understanding more broadly, scientific and social science understanding, that gives us this choice. So being clear about what we know and what we don't know is absolutely crucial to the whole of the climate change debate. Just to labour the point a little bit, really, when we talk about climate predictions, at least in the climate science community, we tend to be talking about changing temperatures, rainfall, changing frequency of heat waves or floods, or maybe changing crop yields of the size of things like that. But I would say that we need to be going much further than that. We need to be painting pictures of society. If the impacts of floods and landslides and heat waves are such that we're going to be constantly rebuilding, needing to rebuild communities, transport, electricity, communication networks, if there's a constant demand to do that because we're constantly being hit by physical changes in the climate system, then we will be unable to spend on other aspects of our society, whether that's educational, social care or health systems. These are not unconnected. They cannot be disassociated. And those pictures of the future are about what sort of society you can imagine being consistent with this changing physical world. So to quantify that, we need to bring in the social sciences very deeply, but we start essentially from the physical sciences. So it's all about prediction, but it's a certain sort of prediction. It's not like predicting the outcome of rolling a dice or of tomorrow's weather. And that's because the system itself is changing state. It's like the dice changing to a different sort of dice. And we know that. That's fairly clear from observations. I'm not sure. Oh, I can't point. So these are just a very old plot here of carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere over the last 650,000 years. It looks very similar up to 2 million years in the latest report they have that. And over this entire period, carbon dioxide concentrations have been between 180 and 280 parts per million. Anatomically modern humans only arose around 200,000 years ago, and human civilizations only around 10,000 years ago. So human civilizations have lived in this really stable period here. since the Industrial Revolution, we have taken, the climate has gone way outside that bound of 180 to 280, up to 418 in 2022, if you would make allowance for other greenhouse gases, up to 454. Now this affects how much energy there is in the system, and we're talking about coming way outside anything that we've seen for at least the last 2 million years. That means the way the system works will be different. It's a change in the dice that we're rolling. And just to, and that means that our observations of the past aren't necessarily going to describe how the processes will work in the future. If you think about, if you've got a kettle and you observe it warming from 60 to 90 degrees over a minute, you take some observations. If your only knowledge of the future is based on those observations, you'll say, well, it's warmed by 30 degrees in a minute, it's going to warm by another 30 degrees in the next minute. We're going to get to 120 degrees. But of course, we know that's not true. None of us would expect that. We know that the water's going to boil at 100. This is the kind of thing we're talking about. The way the climate system works will change, and the observations we have of it in the past don't necessarily tell us in what way. Now, this is important for climate change science more generally, because it affects how we should test and evaluate our climate models, for instance. The fact that a climate model does a good simulation of the past isn't necessarily an indication that it's going to represent what happens in the future. Or in climate economics, if we're going out trying to say what are the impacts of climate change on our economic systems, on our societies, going around and saying, well, actually, this is what we've observed as societies in the recent past, how they have behaved in response to changes in temperature, will only provide a certain limited piece of information as to how they will change in the future. What we need to do is consider processes and interactions. We need to consider kind of the physics of the economics. And we need to understand and imagine how these systems will behave in circumstances which we've never before experienced. We require a certain degree of imagination here, and that's something I'm going to come back to in a moment. So the third characteristic is that climate change is essentially a one-shot bet. We take actions, we've taken actions, some actions in the last 20 or 30 years, we're going to take actions in the next 10 to 20 years. These will affect how the rest of the century pans out, but in making climate predictions, we have to make them probabilistically. You can't make a deterministic prediction of how the future climate will develop. You're going to, climate prediction consists of some sort of probability distribution for different types of behaviour. So that might be saying that there's a 90% probability that the change in temperatures in some place will be between 3 and 6 degrees or something. Now, we're all actually familiar with these things. Probability predictions are not unusual. We have them in insurance, in investment. We have them in everyday occurrences. When I think about how long it's going to take me to get to Paddington to catch a train, I have some idea of a distribution of how long that might take. And we use those distributions repeatedly. And the distributions help us make a good decision on average. Sometimes I'll miss the train. Sometimes I'll catch it. The distribution helps them make a good decision that I'm most likely to catch it and only miss it as often as I'm willing to accept. It's that repeatability in using of the predictions that we are familiar with. But that's not what climate change is about. Climate change, we take our actions now, and there will be one 21st century. And that's it. We may get good predictions about the probabilities of different outcomes. They might be good predictions. They might be accurate probabilities, but we will only experience one. And that raises questions about our attitude to risk, particularly societal and existential risk. The fourth characteristic is nonlinearity, and this goes to the most mathematical aspect of the book, and it's at the core of what I'm talking about in the book. Now, many of you will be familiar with the idea of mathematical chaos, the idea expressed by Ed Lorenz in terms of could the flap of a butterfly's wings in Amazonia affect whether you have a tornado in Texas at some future point in time. This kind of sensitivity is absolutely crucial to weather forecasting, but is often taken not to be so important for climate forecasting. Because weather forecasting, we're trying to be a bit more deterministic. We're trying to define exactly what will happen within a particular trajectory, whereas with the climate, we're trying to get those probability distributions. We run our models many times with slightly different starting conditions, which is great, and that gives us different outcomes in the future, and from that we build our probability distributions. So far, so good, but that's not where the challenge is coming. The challenge is coming from 3 additional aspects there. First is that what tends not to be considered is that these probability distributions, these climate forecasts themselves, are sensitive to the conditions that we assume for today when we're making a prediction. Second is that we're using models for this, but the models are different to reality. So even if we had good observations of the climate system, we would still have questions over what is the most informative way to start up our models. And third is that this aspect of nonlinearity doesn't just affect how we start our models. It's not just that butterfly effect. It's also about how we create our models and how we build them and how close to reality they need to be. And there's been suggestions and work done by people in this room and also, I believe, online on that raise questions about just how good a climate model needs to be able to make good predictions. It could be that these sorts of predictions are sensitive to the finest details of how they're formulated. A concept called the hawk moth effect, named by Erica Thompson. So all these forms of nonlinearity are crucial to understanding climate change and crucial to designing experiments that will tell us most usefully about the future. Fifth characteristic is simply the lure of powerful computers. We live in an age of massive expansion of computing capacity. And this has changed the research landscape way beyond climate. But in many ways, we're dashing forward with an assumption that if we can represent it on a computer, that we can answer a question. We're not really in a world where that's the case yet. We haven't worked out how to answer certain questions with computers. And the lure of powerful computers takes a lot of resources away from thinking carefully about the problem, or even from thinking carefully about how we use the computers to help answer the problem. The sixth is multidisciplinarity, which I've mentioned several times. All of the disciplines, there are so many disciplines involved in studying climate change, and they all interact with each other. And they all come, experts in these disciplines all come with their own perspective and their own understanding of what they think is most important. And by and large, those perspectives are not shared. And it would be extremely helpful if they were. And then finally, perhaps the most obvious one, which most of you coming into the room would be aware of, is that there's an urgency here. We need information to help us plan the future and to understand quite what we know. This is kind of obvious if you're thinking about climate change, but it's an unusual factor in fundamental research science. And a lot of what I'm talking about here has aspects of fundamental research science. So this idea that we need to not just get the right answer, but get the right answer essentially now, means that we really need to reflect a lot harder on where the structures that we're using, the approaches we're taking, can actually give us the answers we want, or actually giving us something different. So those are my characteristics. They interact with each other. Many of them do not matter if you're having, if you have one sort of problem, but in combination they do matter for climate change. So nonlinearity might not be a problem, but when it's combined with extrapolation, it is. The lure of new computing isn't really a problem, except for the fact that it's combined with an urgency role. So I want to finish in the last 3 minutes by just raising 3 further points. One is just to say that uncertainty is part of what we know. With climate predictions, there are inevitably uncertainties, and there are different types of uncertainties. with different characters. But we need to approach the communication of climate uncertainty differently. We shouldn't think of there being predictions and then some uncertainty about them, but rather that predictions consist of information about the scale and character of the uncertainty. The uncertainties are part of the prediction, and we need to communicate that better, and we need to use that information better. It should be intrinsic to all our responses to climate change. The second thing I want to return to was this aspect of imagination, and I just want to give you a short tale. Back in 2008, at the time of the financial crisis of 2008, the Queen came to LSE and she met a number of economists, and she asked them how come the global financial crisis had not been predicted. She said, if these things were so large, how come everyone missed them? And the economists went away and they formed a group called the Global Financial Crisis Forum under the auspices of the British Academy, and talked about it, presumably, quite a lot. And they came back and they wrote to the Queen and they said, well, this was missed by them. This was principally a failure of the collective imagination of many bright people to understand the risks to the system as a whole. And I do think, I think this is a warning sign for the sort of information we get from climate change and how it is used in society. As I said earlier, the seriousness and concern about climate change is really obvious. And my concerns about the uncertainty being misrepresented are almost entirely on what would be called the upper tail. It's on whether we have actually represented the seriousness or the risks of the seriousness of climate change at the worst end of the scales effectively. And then finally, I do still have a minute. Finally, I wanted to say a word about values. It seems to me that we all need to work out our opinions on climate change. We all have our own values, so we shouldn't expect to come to the same conclusions. But we do want to base our assessments of climate change on what we can consider is robust knowledge. There are some things that we do just know, and I think in my book I talk about if I throw a ball up in the air in this auditorium, I wish I had one, then we all expect it to come down. There's lots of stuff in climate change that we just know. But there are lots of things that we haven't tied down, but actually could say we just know. It's about expanding that knowledge of what we know, of painting the pictures of what we know, so that populations can, and individuals can form their own opinions on quite how we should respond. It's a matter of people bringing their own values to the assessment of the seriousness of the issue. It needs to be a democratic issue. It shouldn't be up to the academics to dictate what should happen, but equally, in that wider discourse, we need to make sure that what is understood, what we know to be true, is well communicated, and that is used as the foundation across all these different discussions. So getting the best information we can today really matters. And if some of that information is limited by humanity not being at the stage of understanding things, well, that doesn't worry me. C'est la vie. There's some things we don't understand. But if that information is limited because we aren't combining understanding that is well known, but in different disciplines or in different places, then I think the message is that we need to do better. There are lots of foundational questions that might take a long time to resolve, but there are lots of opportunities to know a lot more in the short term by bringing disciplines together. So I might say that some of the apples are indeed high up in the tree, but there is a lot of low-hanging fruit. And I hope that my book describes some of those. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Dave. I hope that's whetted the appetites of people to learn more and to read the book.
And to ask questions.
And to ask questions, but not yet. But you can start formulating questions. But just now we're going to have Tom. I think you're up on the podium too, yeah? Give us some of your thoughts about the book and what Dave's shared with us.
Thanks for that, Dave. I'm Tom Sheldon from the Science Media Centre. Thanks for inviting me to speak today and to discuss your new book. I know Dave through my day job, which mostly involves me badgering climate scientists like him for quotes and interviews for the BBC or the Daily Mail or Sky News. So I feel like Dave's getting his own back a little bit on me now and making me stand up. So I'm going to speak for about 10 or 12 minutes. But first, I'd just like to congratulate Dave on writing a highly readable and accessible and unpretentious book about climate science. And there are lots of popular books out there about climate change, but rather fewer on climate science. I really think that that's what this is. The more I read of it, the more I started feeling that there's more of a difference between the two than I'd initially thought, particularly when it comes to the intersection of science and the media, which is where I sit. But I confess to feeling a bit nervous about giving this response. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not sure I'd even be very good or effective in an argument with a climate skeptic. Because of my job, I probably know more about climate change than the average person, but on climate science itself, maybe not much more, certainly not in any intricate detail about the data or the physics. And the more I read of Dave's book, the more he made me think about whether that really matters. I'll come back to that in a minute, and I'll reflect on some other themes that his book raised with me, including trust, uncertainty, controversy, and the limits of communicating complex science in the public domain. But I'll start with Dave's distinction between climate science and other disciplines and this concept of what he calls the one-shot bet that he's mentioned himself. And I hope I'm paraphrasing fairly here, that in climate science, we don't have any parallel systems or planets in this case where experimental conditions can be set and a range of outcomes examined. And this makes it quite different to something like cardiology, where you have almost unlimited hearts to test on from humans or pigs or mice. And in climate science, as Dave puts it, we are predicting behavior under conditions we've never seen before. Forget about repeatability. We don't even have one observation of the behavior we're trying to predict in the future. And that made me wonder if this distinction might be important when it comes to communicating climate science to the public. The absence of the kind of proof that, say, a clinical trial can provide certainly seems to make the science more contestable. Skeptics have long targeted modelling as unreliable guesswork, where you can make your model say anything you want. And all the way through this section of Dave's book, I couldn't help but make comparisons with the pandemic, as the same was true there, very similar to climate change in this one-shot bet way that Dave describes, because although we had a lot of data to base expectations on, we only had one chance to get it right. One pandemic, one course of action, one possible future. And as Dave puts it, when it comes to climate change, there's only one 21st century, and we don't have the results from that yet. And those parallels give me cause for both pessimism and optimism. Pessimism because it shows how easy it is to get it wrong when there are so many competing political and economic interests. But optimism because of how the public and the media responded to scientists throughout the pandemic. And just as with climate change, it's been a bumpy ride, but broadly speaking, the overwhelming majority of the public and journalists put their trust in scientists, accepted the uncertainties, acknowledged the trade-offs. That's not to say that everyone just blithely accepted everything that was said. It had to be backed up by evidence. But that most of us look to the science for the very best guidance mustn't be taken for granted. And that means being meticulous when presenting possibilities, uncertainties, worst-case scenarios, etc., as much as in climate science as in infectious disease or epidemiology. And when scientists do that scrupulously, the public listen, the media listen, and it succeeds. When it can fail is when scientists use it as leverage. A few scientists, not many, I'm glad to say, but a few, sailed very close to the wind in the pandemic, brushing uncertainty under the carpet, or straying outside their lane of expertise to overclaim for a scenario and insist that politicians must do A or B would definitely happen. And the same happens from time to time in climate science as well. I can understand the temptation, but I think ultimately it's self-defeating. Science was put under the spotlight during the pandemic, just as climate science was after ClimateGate. Yet in both cases, science and scientists came out as respected and trusted as ever, maybe even more so. And that level of trust is maintained precisely because scientists communicate within the bounds that evidence allows without being selective or trying to tell people what to do. And all this raises the subject of uncertainty, another major theme of Dave's book. And one line that stood out for me was when he writes, "To not tell the uncertainty story is to not tell the climate change story." And it's an important point, and I agree with it. Some people have been nervous over the years that talking too much about uncertainty undermines the rock-solid stuff and makes it look like scientists don't really know anything. But it feels to me that uncertainty is about honesty. Stating what you're sure about, but acknowledging what you're not, demonstrates that you're honest. And that engenders trust. I think Dave puts it as not confusing certainty with confidence. If the scientific community can get that balance right, I think it goes a long way to addressing Dave's challenge 1 in the book, which he puts nicely as how to balance justified arrogance with essential humility. And at the Science Media Centre, we have a number of phrases that we keep coming back to. Humility needed is one that we often repeat about scientists and about ourselves. But that humility also gives you license the other way. When you're confident, don't be afraid to hammer it home over and over again to politicians or journalists or anyone whose ear you can get. And I think that's the kind of justified arrogance that Dave is referring to. And I think we have a common language when it comes to uncertainty. So much of climate science makes predictions in ranges, or expresses temperature rise in terms of probabilities and so on. And that language is very familiar and accessible to normal people. We're used to it in everyday life. The trick is not to be lured into appearing too certain, or it will come back to bite you, as it did when one scientist confidently predicted in 2009 that the Arctic would be ice-free by the summer of 2015. Dave has spoken about the deep questions in climate science that can get crowded out by the passion that people have for their views of the subject. And I think this was a case in point, and it backfired. And honesty about uncertainty goes down well with journalists too. Politicians and campaigners trade in definitive slogans and sound bites. It's rare to hear a politician do an interview where they admit with much humility the things that they're not sure about or the answers they don't have, which could explain why their trust ratings have been rock bottom for years. And I've always liked Dave instinctively because he's not a soundbite merchant. You can actually see him physically contort his face with the effort of making sure that the next thing he's about to say is definitely right and doesn't cut corners or brush something as inconvenient as uncertainty under the carpet. And it's that approach to detail and accuracy that people look to the scientific profession to provide. I want to say a bit about controversy and the place of science in public discourse and in journalism. There are whole chunks of Dave's book that address some of the controversies, or at least contentious areas, in climate science itself, for example, on interdisciplinary studies, or whether the research framework that we have is fit for purpose, or the way that models are constructed and tested. And that's crucially important stuff for scientists. But of course, in the wider world, these are largely invisible problems, and it's not what most people think of as controversy. What was controversial was back in around 2010, when the most fundamental claims of climate science were being openly challenged and distrusted in the mainstream media. The tree ring stuff, the hockey stick, the pause in warming, was it all just natural? Even one winter when it snowed a lot, that was controversial. And climate skeptics had a field day. And that was a pitched battle which skeptics